magic schools are a fairly recent phenomenon in fantasy. They don't begin with Hogwarts, but it is certainly the most prominent example. Generally, magic school's origins sits with Ursula K. Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea from 1968. And yet, considering how recent of an entry it is to the canon of fantasy fiction, the concept is really well established. In nearly every magic school tale of the last 60 years, a promising young fellow or fellowess from relatively obscure origins goes off to hone their talents under the tutelage of strange and mysterious teachers, before getting involved in some dark business, a grander plot, and a problem only they can solve. All the way into modern anime, which has really run with this trend, all of these basic building blocks are there, almost always peppered in with some rare protagonist magic, an in-school conspiracy or two, bullies, homework, and almost always a boarding school environment. I mean, it's all coded very much like any prestigious British boarding school, with class divides and eccentric tenured schoolmasters galore. But does this British boarding private school model, which many fantasy magic schools seem to be modelled around, does this actually make sense? I'm not convinced. In Earthsea, at least, I would contend that the concept of a wizarding school does make sense for that world. Across the books, there are presented myriad other ways of learning magic, but magic in Earthsea is largely tied to one's personal mastery of the spoken language of magic, a potent, reality-shaping ancient draconic tongue. Learning magic at school is a matter of using your innate power to learn the skill of speaking in this magical language. But it must also be said that historically the way to learn a language was not to sit in a classroom with a load of your peers and a knowledgeable teacher at the front. Learning, in the ancient world especially, was a matter of having some privilege, so that you could be hired a tutor by your family. Otherwise, you would be, most likely, if you wanted an education, probably bundled off to some religious institution that was also training you to do a job in their institution, such as a scribe. Frankly, the best way to learn a language is immersion with a native speaker, or really, immersion into a foreign place that speaks your chosen language naturally. This is why, throughout history, children are hired foreign tutors and are sent off to strange new lands to learn. In Earthsea, though, you can't exactly go and live with dragons to learn their language, and the only native speakers of this language of true names and of magic are the very mages who are attempting to master it. And so, actually, this school environment makes some degree of sense, because the only people who can teach it are accomplished mages. And so if all of these accomplished mages have settled down, stopped doing magic and decided that they're going to educate, well, then that's a pretty solid way to learn. But there is another problem with magic schools being modelled largely on a kind of traditional British schooling system. The presence of multiple subjects. Throughout most of history, learning has been specialised. Very specialised. If you were lucky enough to get in an education at all, through faith, for example, your curriculum would be largely based on the specific things that faith wishes to teach you. You would learn the nuances of prayer and doctrine, and might come across some mathematics or some politics. But the primary methods of learning would be learning language, learning to write, learning to memorise religious passages, and recitation, and maybe, if you're very lucky, some philosophy. If you were lucky enough to be educated at the leisure of your family, well, you'd have a tutor, or a selection of them. People who have studied their own specialisms at further education institutions, and who have been brought in to train up the progeny of this great noble house. Oftentimes, tutors were students themselves, or academics needing some money, a stipend, or some noble patronage. So to be educated in the ancient world and much of history, you kind of had to be lucky. Either lucky enough to be sent to a place of faith for your education, which largely, if you were sent to a place of faith, you did also generally tend to have to be wealthy to gain the fullest amounts of education. Otherwise, the people who turn up at faith institutions with no learning whatsoever, well, they tend to be not quite taught so thoroughly and effectively. If your father is a patron of this monastery, you're going to get better treatment. Or you can skip the middleman and you can be lucky just by being rich. And even if you were rich, the wide run of subjects was just not available. You learned what your tutors could teach. Now, of course, here I am missing the most common form of education throughout history. Learning from a master. The master-apprentice relationship is central to almost all human cultures. It allows for the direct transfer of practical skills and experience across generations, allowing for knowledge, expertise, and skills not to die out with the death of the master. This type of educational relationship is most commonly seen in the trades, generally, in the modern day, wherein this order of masters and apprentices and juniors and journeymen kind of has become a stratified social order. It creates a ladder of competence, seniority, professionalism, and indeed skill. So why do we use magic schools at all? When historically the most common method of learning anything was training in a craft under an expert. Well, I think this all goes back to our fundamental expectations of what magic is. Is magic an art, a craft, or a skill? Let's define what I mean, using further education institutions as a kind of modern example. To be good at an art, you need some degree of artistic talent, flair, and also sensitivity to your medium. Art schools can only really hone pre-existing skills, reinforce basics, provide opportunities and networks for students, and allow space and mentoring for students to develop their own talents into their own voice. Craft or trade schools, on the other hand, start without an expectation of great natural talent and consist of a lot of practical training in often relatively linear basics to advanced progression. Early on in your educational career in a trade school, your attempts at doing the thing are going to be almost necessarily worse than your attempts at doing that thing later, or once you've graduated. And technique is very central to methodology. The goal is to produce someone who is qualified to practice a certain craft. A professional who can then go and do the job. This is how we educate art and craft. But what about skill? It's a bit more nebulous. The primary locus for education in skills, in at least modern day higher education, are universities. These promote the joint skills of researching and presenting data. Especially in the modern day, this also includes test taking and rote learning as well. I talked about universities in this style in my video specifically on fantasy universities. So check that out for more. But generally, a university seeks to tutor a specific set of curated skills, referencing, researching, writing, and presenting, which can be eventually honed into an area of specific interest, where the student is eventually expected to surpass the mentor or master or supervisor in a specific, tiny, hyper-specific area, and then goes off to teach, using their knowledge in that hyper-specific area in a different institution, or perhaps the same institution, or uses their learnings in researching and writing and presenting data in a career such as medicine or law. These descriptions of the distinction between art, craft, and skill education are broad and they do overlap, but they will serve well enough for our purposes in discussing magic schools. My point, education is not one single path, and the best approach to education depends entirely on what is trying to be taught. So perhaps the reason that magic schools all look very similar to one another is because, for all of them, Their magic systems are best taught in a British-style boarding school environment, or, as is the case in some modern Japanese manga and anime, a barely disguised school veneer placed over the more classic dungeon crawl. Surely this is the explanation. Surely all fantasy world builders consider whether their magic system is an art, a craft, or a skill before consigning themselves to writing about a magic school that's very similar to 1950s Britain. Harry Potter's world building has been heavily criticised throughout the years, and rightfully so. But Hogwarts itself is a very clear example of a world which has entirely the wrong schooling system for its magic system. Magic, in the world of Harry Potter, is a craft. It requires precise, trained and practiced movements that advance in complexity in a linear fashion to do the harder spells. And other than dexterity and general magical potential, the skills learned in learning one spell are not generally transferable to the rest of the corpus of education. And don't get me started on things like potion making, which doesn't require the same basic craft as spellcasting. In this world, you can be atrocious at making potions, but excellent at levitation or combat magic. There's little overlap across the spectrum. Another reason why magic is a craft in the Harry Potter world is because it is intensely practical. Most of the spells learned and most of the classes learned go on very, very clearly to indicate a future trade path. Alchemist for potions, diviner for divinations, monster tamer and handler for the animal one, herbalist for herbalism. All of these different job-type specialisms have their own professors, their own tutors, and their own spaces in Hogwarts to be studied. And all of them are jobs in the world of Harry Potter that success in school drives you towards. For goodness sake, the school literally acts as a license-awarding body for apparition. Personal teleportation, the closest Wizarding World analogue to a car or motorbike license. It makes far more sense for this kind of programme to be included in a vocational or trade school than your classic British boarding school. I mean, can you imagine a school taking time out of its day to teach all the students how to drive? This is learning a craft from a master so that you can have a licence to practice it in the real world. A school that is focused on exams at the end of the year for 16 and 18-year-olds doesn't really seem like the right fit for a licence-awarding body for personal teleportation to me. Training to be an aura or a magical policeman should be a vocational choice partway down the line in Hogwarts, not something that you can go into if you have good grades across the spectrum. It should be a stream, a specific stream within the school where they learn the skills and craft necessary to work in this field. After all, in terms of social practice, Hogwarts is the last step any person gets of their education. The last stop before professional life, and it issues licenses and permits for magic use in the professional world. The majority of wizards in this world are shown not to have the most impressive of skills outside of their own personal specialism in their profession. Very few, for example, have the combat skills to fight off the Death Eaters. And this world-building detail also supports a schooling system which focuses on dividing students into specific craft-based streams that will take them into a professional job working as, say, a potion maker. Honestly, an institution that serves as a massive umbrella for all of the disparate trades that one can do in magical Britain doesn't make a ton of sense anyway. Individualised apprenticeships or specialised technical schools for certain crafts makes a lot more sense. A police academy, for example. The thing is, in the modern Western world, we often forget that schooling has a purpose. It was a path to a better life, a way in to a promising career. Or it enabled the development of deeper philosophical thoughts or knowledge of gods and faith, which may well have been considered the most important thing at some points. In many modern schools, the end goal is achieving some form of academic qualification. which is then taken as some sort of indication of intelligence and aptitude for all sorts of random things. But in reality, these grades and results are largely ignored by the vast majority of the professional world. Historically, the modern state of affairs is, frankly, bizarre. We live in a world that kind of prescribes education for education's sake. That is a historical anomaly. So how can we do magic schools better? How do we avoid recreating our own modern, weird schooling system in our fantasy worlds? Because oftentimes it doesn't feel like it connects at all to the magic or to the world building. Well, there is a reason why classic fantasy often has the wizard's or sorcerer's apprentice. Magic as a craft to be apprenticed in is a common feature of these kind of classic fantasy tales. And magic user on its own is kind of just a job, rather than magic users having to be lecturers or researchers or educators, or indeed tied to adventuring. There are many successful examples of the wizard's or sorcerer's apprentice throughout fantasy media, and it is a brilliant way to go if magic is craft in your world. So I won't belabour this point. I suppose the real trouble comes in the fact that magic school stories are often targeted at a very specific demographic. Those who are in school, or those who have a nostalgia for school days. This means that there is a pressure in the magic school genre to create a school that feels like it has some reflection of real life school experiences. It's not too hard to imagine school, but it's just all English lessons. If, like in Earthsea, language and its skilled use are central to the system of magic, well, this school system can make a great deal of sense for a skill-based school system. It's just all lessons in one specific thing, which is also how magic works. Classes in linguistics, elocution, and grammar make sense. It's coherent. Indeed, school, but a single subject, is a very good and also quite historically accurate way of presenting a magical education. Art, dance and sport all represents different methods by which magic can be used in certain fantasy worlds. And so schools focused just on physical education lessons kind of makes sense. Whether it's training to hone movement, hone one's own body, or to find one's own specific creative flair or art, in a school like this, perhaps an arts school, this can work fairly simply, and it is relatable, because we've all had a physical education lesson, and some of us actually liked it. But if your goal is to, as best as possible, reproduce a British school environment with some intellectual disparity, difference in ability across various subjects, class disparity, a mixture of diverse and interesting people, some bullying, some cruel teachers, and general childish hijinks, well, you need a magic system that can support this being the best way to educate people. A magic system that relies not on birthright for the sole impetus on magical talent. If you want to have anyone from any other background than nobility, that's a necessity. And you need it to be simple and safe enough to instruct a class filled with children in the most chaotic and difficult time of their lives, their teenage years. And so magic can't really be that dangerous, or potentially dangerous if used accidentally or incorrectly, or for practical jokes. So probably no channeling the other world, or elemental summoning, or mind control. Really, you can't have that much powerful magic at all, because it will make it nigh on impossible for a class of 30 to make it through a year. And most of all, you need magic to be a skill. Not an art, not a talent, not a craft. You need it to be a skill that is teachable and replicatable and efficient and reproducible, like mathematics. Otherwise, you need to start getting very, very inventive in creating explanations for how this can all operate. Why does this school have ancient, powerful, dark secrets on his grounds? How do the administrators stop the children from blowing each other up? Who funds this elaborate magical school? Are there wards that prevent the worst of chaotic behaviour? And how come there's always that one kid with a troubled and difficult past who ends up becoming either a prodigy or a villain or both? The simplest way to do all of this and have it feel right is, of course, religion. Education and religion have been tied together basically as long as they've existed, but there's a lot of trepidation in modern fantasy about going down that particular rabbit hole, tying your magic system and your schooling system all into faith seems to set off some alarm bells. People don't want to go down that particular rabbit hole, which I think is a massive shame, because religion is such a potent and interesting force in our world's history. But then again, a lot of the time when people do try and incorporate faith symbolism and those sorts of things, we end up with essentially just Catholicism again. It's weirdly Catholic coded, right down to, in some cases, nuns' habits and crucifixes, which is like strange. Here I am off largely talking about anime. Anime has a strange fixation with Catholic imagery. I might need to make a video on that. I suppose for the fantasy world builder who's a little too nervous to include organised religion as a central feature of magic and society in their works, I can offer a kind of answer for where to look in history for some inspiration. Ancient China, because skill-based academies were used as political and social tools to raise their founders' status in local and national scales, as well as to supply learned men to the courts across the region. And with the adoption of Confucianism as dominant mainstream educational philosophy across the lands of China in the Han Dynasty, this ensures that the civil servants and bureaucrats and diplomats of the day were well versed in philosophy and statecraft. Heck, by the 7th century there were national exams instituted to determine one's potential for bureaucracy. Just replace bureaucracy in these examples with magic, and you're pretty much onto a winner. Again, assuming that magic in your world is a skill that can be taught in an educational institution of this kind. That is useful, but not instantaneously destructive if done wrong, or dangerous, or inappropriate for children. But then again, replacing bureaucracy with magic does sound a little bit like a recipe for disaster anyway. But that's all we have time for. I hope this video has been interesting in allowing you a little bit more of a framework to think through the relationship between magic systems and education systems, because it's important. If we're going to keep using magic schools, we need to make sure they match. Please, a little bit. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.